Good morning. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of Belarus after its presidential election. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to encourage you to stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's work by visiting our website and signing up for our newly released newsletter. So many of you are familiar with our blogs, our podcasts, and our other products. But as of this week, we've started a once a week on Mondays newsletter where you can find everything in one place. So please go to our website, sign up for the newsletter, and you can get access to the blogs, events, and other notes of interest. And actually, as relates to this, we had a very excellent infographic that was prepared by one of our colleagues, Nina, that looks specifically at the Belarus election. So today's guests, I'm very pleased to introduce, are Alessia Rudnik, Artyom Shrybaum, and Dr. Victoria Lukashenko. Alessia Rudnik is the director of the independent Belarusian think tank, the Center for New Ideas, and a PhD candidate in political science at Karlstad University in Sweden. Artyom Shrybaum is a Belarusian political analyst, founder of Sense Analytics Consultancy, and non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. And Dr. Victoria Lukashenko is a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies and a former George F. Kennan Fellow at the Kennan Institute. So after our guests speak, there's going to be a question and answer period for the audience. I encourage you, please submit your questions, and you can do so by going to the Q&A function at the base of your Zoom screen. And you can do it at any point during the first 30 to 35 minutes when we're having a discussion with the guests. So submit your question, but please be sure to include your name and affiliation when doing so. And finally, today's discussion is being recorded. So I want to start, Victoria, with you. If you can set the stage a little bit for us about the presidential election that just took place. Maybe tell us when it was, kind of what the outcome was. And we know that this election was denounced by Western governments and Belarusian democratic forces as undemocratic. And so could you elaborate, what was undemocratic about it? Where does this stand in the history of elections in Belarus?
Hi, everyone, and huge thanks to the Kennan Institute for organizing and inviting me to this timely and important panel discussion. Indeed, the elections that took place on the 26th of January, as a result of which Lukashenko scored over 80% of popular vote, they were widely denounced by the West as a sham, as a self-reappointment of Lukashenko, as basically elections without choice. And for any elections to be considered democratic, free, and fair, they need to adhere to certain international standards. And these 2025 Belarus elections, they basically failed to meet even minimum amount of standards during each and every phase of the electoral process. Andreas Schadler, who is one of the leading scholars in the field of electoral authoritarianism, he argues that authoritarian leaders, they often employ various strategies from the so-called menu of electoral manipulations, which help them to break the links in the chain of democratic choice, ultimately rendering these elections neither free nor fair. And I would like to highlight 5 key areas of concern, or 5 sort of components, elements from this menu of electoral manipulations, which basically resulted in these elections being undemocratic. So the first major problem was that elections took place in a highly repressive environment. Although Lukashenko pardoned several political prisoners, both in 2024 and 2025, the prosecutions based on political grounds continued. And in 2024 alone, over 1,000 individuals were sent into prisons. In addition to that, all the key democratic leaders, the leaders of the 2020 protests in Belarus, they remain behind bars, including the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Ales Bialiatski. And in addition to that, Lukashenko has completely wiped out democratic political parties and also civil society organizations. And all these strategies, they helped him to strengthen his control over the electoral process. The second major area of concern is media freedoms. Media is being very tightly controlled in Belarus. The Lukashenko regime has labeled all the major independent media outlets as extremist, and the representatives of these independent media outlets are either in prisons or function from exile. To be more precise, 400 representatives of independent media are currently abroad, have to function from exile. So basically, this strategy allowed Lukashenko to monopolize the narrative around the elections and deprive the Belarusian citizens from alternative sources of information. The third problem that I would like to highlight is the registration of candidates. In these elections, in addition to Lukashenko, there were 4 other candidates, but they are not real opponents. They cannot be considered real opponents. They are spoiler candidates, and their main goal is just to create this illusion of political competition. In fact, a very common joke among Belarus analysts is that the only real choice that Belarusians had on the election day was the choice of food and drinks at the polling station's cafeteria. The fourth major area of concern was the manipulations that took place on the E-Day, on the election day itself. And here I would like to especially point out the strategies of the regime to inflate the voter turnout when many people were noticed voting several times. There are also some really ridiculous examples when people from the hospitals who are on the reanimation lists, they were actually put on the, they were seen as voting basically in the elections. In addition to that, the Belarusians were banned from voting abroad. It was not allowed to photograph the ballots. The curtains were taken off from the voting booth. So all these strategies helped Lukashenko to manipulate the electoral results. And the final problem that I would like to speak about is the lack of independent election observation. These elections were not observed, for example, by the OSCE or Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. Basically, the Lukashenko failed to send the invitation to these independent observers on time, and there is, as a result, the lack of this neutral oversight further compromised the integrity of the electoral results. So overall, as a result of all these strategies, elections, the 2025 presidential so-called elections cannot be considered legitimate or democratic. But in fact, maybe very briefly, I would also like to try to link the first question that you asked to another important question. I think many of us wonder or have wondered, why would dictators decide to hold these elections in the first place if the results are already predetermined, if we all know who is going to be the winner? And I would like to argue that, in fact, elections, they fulfill at least 3 main functions for the authoritarian leaders. The first such function is to signal invincibility and control. So basically, by holding elections, dictators show that the situation in the country is fully under control. They can withstand internal, external pressure, and any attempts to challenge their rule are futile. The second major function, which is in fact sometimes overlooked by the analysts, is that elections, they help the authoritarian leaders to gather politically relevant information. Basically, elections, they present this opportunity to take a snapshot of here and now and allow the authoritarian leaders to monitor the popular support in the society, to learn about the strategies of the opposition, and to use this information to inform their future policies and decisions, and as a result become more resilient. So in this way, elections, they are seen as tools of resilience for non-democratic leaders. And the final function why dictators would think of holding the final reason why dictators would think of holding elections is, of course, to preserve legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, elections allow the authoritarian rulers to basically re-establish the link with the loyal part of the society and also create this notion that they are popular, although the result can be manipulated. But also internationally, the dictators send signals to each other that the situation in the country is under control, and the like-minded leaders who watch these elections very closely, for instance, the leader in Russia, the leader in China, they can see that the system has passed this stress test, and therefore this dictator can be considered as a reliable partner for future cooperation. And of course, dictators don't really care about whether the Western countries would recognize the results or not. In one of his recent interviews, Lukashenko clearly remarked that he is not bothered what the Western democratic governments think about these elections.
Victoria, that's incredible. Incredible outlining of the circumstances and just so carefully explained, between the 5 areas of concern with respect to the elections and then the 3 main follow-ups. And I like the fact you refer to it as a system because it's very clearly a system, right? This just didn't happen overnight that the elections occurred in this way. I myself have a number of follow-ups, but I'm going to hold them for later on. And again, fantastic response. I want to move on to Alessia and specifically look at political repression, which was one of the areas that Victoria highlighted. So Alessia, I know this is a very personal topic for you. Could you please tell us, now that Lukashenko has extended his mandate, do you think we're going to expect to see a strengthening or an easing of political repression in the country? And again, maybe just elaborate on what is the political repression situation? What do you think the trajectory might be?
Thanks a lot, Jennifer, and all the listeners and my co-speakers. It's important to talk about the election, even though, as Victoria mentioned before, the autocrats are not necessarily interested in conducting the free and fair election, but they do it for some of the reasons that Victoria mentioned above. And talking about the repression, I think it's important to highlight that we are not getting enough signals from the Belarusian regime to actually read them and to interpret them in a most accurate way. So all of this is a rather speculation of analysts, of expert community. But just relying on the historical examples of autocracies and on authoritarianism studies, there would be a need to probably highlight that the first argument for why the repression cannot last forever is that the repressive mechanisms and tactics of any autocratic regime is actually a very costly measure. It costs regime quite a bit of administrative resources, a lot of financial investment, a lot of distraction of the administrative resources and law enforcement services from their other types of jobs that could be actually socially significant. So it costs a lot for the regime to actually support this level of repression by making clear the argument why the law enforcement services and other political elites should actually invest their time, their working time into the system. But because Belarus is very centralized and highly controlled political system, the situation is what we observed during the last years. And from that said, I would expect the level of repression to stay approximately on the same level if I were to guess. But at the same time, as I mentioned, signals are unclear. And by far, the regime has already cracked down on most of its enemies by repressing the opposition and pushing it out from the country, by completely controlling the informational space, by repressing those who have somewhat, I would say, very, very weak ties with any types of activism or democratic movement. But also, if we take it all together, both that the regime has already repressed its major opponents and that it's a costly measure, I would think that unless we see some kind of geopolitical escalation, that the level of repression will increase. But on the other hand, it's also difficult to see how the regime can afford to stop the repression right now. And it's a matter of trust to its citizens. It's a matter of the fact that regime sees threats everywhere possible. And I think that something that we will see in the future is probably the attempt to decrease cost of repression by legalizing it, by putting everything possible into the legal regulation, into the legal practice, and to legalize any kind of repressions that have been in place and are not still in the legal regulation of the country. So I think that some of these measures will be legalized for them to serve as a preventive measure for the citizens to be scared to act, to express their opinion. They will most certainly regard the various forms of violation of freedoms rather than spending resources on actual sanctioning of the alternative opinions. And that would be the strategy that I can see in the nearest maybe 5 years or so. Another question that I got regarded whether we should see the fact of release of political prisoners as a signal that we can interpret in some rational way, and what could be this rationale. And I think that it was certainly some kind of signal to first the Western countries in general, although there are also some speculations that maybe it was also a form of response to the demand within the Belarusian society that is expressing or anticipating de-escalation following the political crisis of 2020. However, as we know from previous experience, the regime is not really concerned about the opinion of Belarusians. So I would still bet on the strategy of engaging with the West in some forms. And I'm sure that the regime is not so naive that it thinks that the sanctions will be lifted because of that, or that there will be any other forms of softening of the relations between Belarusian authorities and West. But I would still consider it as a form of signaling the intent to actually start the communication again, start some kind of dialogue, and become maybe closer again, even though we understand that West is not really buying these arguments and is not really prepared to start talking to Lukashenko and his regime again. So the signal was, I think, meant to probably mitigate the reaction on the upcoming presidential election or already past presidential election, and probably also a possibility to sense whether there is a possibility for some warming up of relations with the Western countries. However, again, there is no significant response to that and appreciation of this strategy. My colleague here, Artem Schreiman, has written about it, and there is this opinion within the Belarusian expert community that probably the Western countries should have somehow reacted on the fact of release of political prisoners to actually move on with this practice to release as many people as possible. But unfortunately, we don't have any evidence to that, but rather analysis and speculation.
No, thank you, Alessia. And just for our audience, just the number of people who are political prisoners in different capacities, it's staggering, right? And you're right, that the lack of attention and generally that it's getting is also staggering. So no, thank you for outlining this and also outlining just the signaling mechanism that you think that the government is using by means of this. I want to turn to Artem and kind of segueing over and looking at democratic forces now and ask you first, a lot of Western governments do recognize Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as the legitimate leader of Belarus based on her 2020 electoral victory. So do you think that the 2025 election Is this going to affect her in any way, whether as a representative of Democratic Belarus or in other capacities? Well, how do you see this impacting her right now and maybe moving forward?
Thank you very much. I think that Belarusian democratic forces and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in particular are no longer that dependent on the electoral cycle within Belarus because in reality, no government in the world has recognized her as president-elect or as like a leader of the government in exile. Mostly her status has been sort of recognized politically as a form of some declaration, as a form of admission her as the representative of the alternative Belarus. At the same time, the lack of formalities here may be a virtue because it sort of unties her from the formalities within Belarus, from this electoral cycles that Lukashenko keeps going. And that is why her legitimacy, quote unquote, currently, I would say, is mostly functional. She is occupying the leading role in the democratic forces because she can secure the most, salient level of representation of Belarus. She can be received at the highest possible level. No other opposition leader or structure can match this. And so this is currently the actual resource, the political resource that she possesses. Her likely electoral victory in 2020 is an important root of this legitimacy, but to be perfectly honest, these days, it's hard to imagine that many Western leaders, when thinking about Belarus, given everything that's happening in the world and in the region and in Ukraine and around Ukraine, take a lot of, time memorizing what has happened in Belarus in 2020. So Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has become this symbol. I view her mission and the mission of her allies as more of a diplomatic mission. And as the diplomats, they do their job, I think, to the maximum of their abilities. But as the political actors, especially as domestic political actors, I think that there is currently simply no space for them to operate. And there, I've seen already a question in the Q&A on this particular topic, which I can also incorporate in my answer here because it's actually relevant. This is definitely the case, and even the democratic forces themselves admit this, that their connection with the voters that they've sort of won over in 2020 has been becoming thinner and thinner. 4.5 years, 5 years in forced exile does not add to your popularity at home. And your ability to influence or have any impact on the political dynamics at home. So again, right now, I think it would be a misunderstanding or let's say a wrong terminology to view these people as domestic politicians because there is simply no domestic politics to be participating in. Belarusian regime has consolidated substantially since 2020, and the elections, even in this, Belarusian way of running elections have changed over time, and we got from very limited space for political competition to China, North Korea, Turkmenistan levels of political competition on the elections. So, therefore, viewing the democratic forces of Belarus through the prisms or through the lenses of normal political competition will be simply a wrong approach.
Yeah, no, thank you, Artem. And I am going to ask a follow-up question to that because the way you explained things was so helpful. So given the reality, and we know frequently, right, exile communities or diaspora communities with time, they lose their connection to the people who are actually still in the country. So who do you think at this point, and given, again, the highly repressive environment, which both Victoria and Alicia talked about, who are the key political forces in the Belarusian democratic movement today, whether they're in the country or at this point, who do you think really is speaking for what's going on that's in opposition to the Lukashenko regime?
When I described waning influence of democratic forces inside the country, I didn't imply that there was somebody occupying this role. There is no domestic opposition. There is no alternative, more popular or famous or influential leaders of Belarusian democratic opposition, then Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and probably her number two, Pavel Latushka. And inside the country, there are several, popular politicians, political leaders who were very popular in 2020 because they were the ones who actually got the revolution going, and they are jailed. And therefore, we don't know much about their own political ambitions, because 5 years in jail is no joke, in a Belarusian jail, even less so. And therefore, whether we can still consider them, political leaders, do they want to be considered as such? Nobody knows. But definitely they have some moral authority inside the country. And obviously, there is no way of running the free and transparent and reliable poll on the domestic political preferences, especially since it is sometimes methodologically dubious to measure, ratings in the environment where, for the 4.5 years at least, people have been, taught to forget what political competition must look like. Therefore, it's mostly like measuring, like, I don't know, the rating of President Xi in China or things like this. So it's a slightly misplaced approach to analyzing the society, I would say. But as the voice, I think Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is uniquely positioned to speak on behalf of the democratic forces. And again, with all the headwinds that I've described, this should be put into the context of other exiled movements, and compared to Russian diaspora and opposition in exile and other exiled movements, Belarusians actually look, well, many people envy the unity, the level of recognition, the level of support and public awareness about the struggle of Belarusian people. So it's always a question of, comparison. Do you compare them to the influence they got in 2020? It definitely decreased. Do you compare them with all the other similar exiled movements? They are among the leading ones.
Yeah, thank you, Artem. Thank you. I want to pick up on the kind of some comments about society and turn back to Alessia, looking specifically at Belarusian society. So it's been over 30 years since Lukashenko came to power, and over 4 years since the 2020 protests, which we've talked about a little bit. Do you notice any generational changes, either among his support base or among the opposition support base? Again, generationally, what do we see in a 30-year period taking place?
I think it's quite difficult to talk about this question without actually really, really wide and accessible data again. But if we look, for example, at the World Values Survey, we see that the values of Belarusians have slightly shifted over the decades and have become more liberal and are quite liberal at the point. And Belarusians are quite liberal comparing to the other countries as well, to the European population, for example, and are somewhat liberal on certain issues than, for example, the population of America. If we look at the results of Chatham House opinion poll from 2020, then we could see that the certain issues are very much not accepted by the Belarusians and could be classified as more liberal than other countries. It's, however, quite difficult to point to the specific generational change, but I would speculate and say that Lukashenko's support base has shifted from kind of the image of people's candidate in 1994 when he actually won the election, and the election that is the first and last to be considered and recognized as free and fair election in Belarus. And then the opposition was mainly attracting the urban electorate and the intellectual elites. For now, Lukashenko's support is rather both rural and urban, but it mostly depends on the situation of with economy, country's economy, and it's a lot about being employed, for example, the state enterprises and state institutions. But for Lukashenko's support for now, I would say that one of the major factors that has played a lot of role in this is the absence of opportunity to actually elect the president and elect any other officials, which makes people very neutral towards any political and electoral event in the country. They are very depoliticized and not interested in politics at all. And this was the case primarily until 2020, and that is why it's also very easy to point to the shift that occurred in 2020 when we saw lines and queues of people by the polling stations really wanting to take part in this electoral procedure. And then mostly these were people mobilized by the Belarusian opposition. And for the opposition, the shift occurred, from my point of view, with the decrease in rhetorics on national identity and arguments on that were frankly quite radical for the big share of the Belarusian society then, which was for many decades integrated with the Russian economy, with Russia as a neighboring state, etc. So the radical rhetorics on national identity and some of the unpopular arguments of the opponents were also not exactly attractive for part of the population, but also it's important to consider that the opposition has never really had a chance to participate in the equal game, in the equal electoral competition, because the opportunities for the opposition were always restricted, even though we saw now all of these factors that have shaped current campaign that Victoria described at the very beginning. Before that, we saw the same features, even though there were international observers, but the possibilities to take part equally as the competitor of Lukashenko have always been limited. And the shift that has occurred in 2020 is not only the fact that people have joined the electoral day and casted their votes, but also the fact that the oppositional candidates have proposed something else and have proposed something more attractive for the Belarusian population. It's slightly different rhetorics when it comes to economic, cultural prosperity, Belarusian uniqueness, Belarusian competitiveness as well on the international arena, justice, and other values were promoted, and we heard them in public space during the electoral campaign. So these messages were more attractive for the Belarusian population, and probably combined with many other factors, such as failure of the Belarusian regime to handle the COVID pandemic and other economic challenges in the country, were among those factors. But it's important to point as well that the candidates that we saw in 2020 played a lot of role in why we can see some kind of shift or a generational change maybe here, with the electorate of the opposition becoming slightly wider or quite bigger than in, for example, 1994, when it was restricted to the intellectual elites and urban population. And I would also like to maybe address some of the points that Artem mentioned, but also maybe speak a little bit about the gap that exists between the people inside the country and also people outside the country. I got this question as well about the how Belarusians react on the election, and also what kind of divides is there between the Belarusians inside and outside. And I would say that as for any residents of any other autocracies, people actually depoliticize when there is no electoral campaign. It's quite a natural process. But most importantly, they also know that they cannot really change something. And for that matter, invest in their resources and risk in their lives in current political situation is quite irrational action. So that's why we did not see really a lot of protest, a lot of engagement of Belarusians. Not least again, the poll that I've already mentioned before, which was released just 2 days before elections, showed that there is a quite decreasing engagement of Belarusians with the electoral day. So twice as little Belarusians, in particular 36% only, have declared the intention to vote on the electoral day, in comparison to 75% in 2020. And this is quite a interesting number, I would say, considering the official number that was announced 2 days later, which is about 86% of voter turnout. And concerning the gap between the Belarusians inside and outside, I would say that many Belarusians inside the country have actually moved forward, and this is, on the one hand, can be treated as the safety mechanisms to protect themselves, their families from dangerous prosecutions and sanctions that could be imposed on them for example, expressing their political opinion offline or online, or engaging with independent media. And it doesn't mean that they have changed their values or changed and started to support, for example, Lukashenko's regime, but it does mean that the public expression of the dissent in Belarus has significantly decreased. But when we talk about Belarusians outside, it's important to probably note that there are still a lot of Belarusians from the civil society sector and from the independent media who have been quite active, not least the democratic forces and political opposition. They have started their projects from scratch in exile in mostly European countries, but also some probably in other countries, such as Georgia, one of the central hubs for Belarusians in exile as well. But many have also started their new lives and are searching for new jobs, especially now when we consider that the civil society activists that were mainly working based on foreign aid support are now experiencing the crisis because of decisions of certain countries to not provide support, financial support for the Belarusian democratic sector in exile, and this will have some consequences. This will mean that if the situation is to move into the same direction, then the active part of the Belarusian society outside will strongly decrease in first its effectiveness when it comes to their projects, and secondly in numbers. And I think this is important to address as well.
No, thank you, Alessia. And all of these comments, again, everything everyone is saying is so fantastic, and I feel like it's not captured generally for Western audiences. So thank you. And I want to pick up actually on that point that you're making about the international community and turn to Victoria. Can you talk a little bit more about the international context and the international community vis-a-vis Belarus? So what do you think of the sanctions that exist against Belarus? Are they working as intended? And building on that, and based on everything we've heard and everything that the three of you know, what do you think would be more effective means of putting pressure on Lukashenko or the regime to be able to make changes? Kind of what are the existing circumstances, and what would you recommend?
Yes, thank you very much. This is a very important question and a very complex question. Well, sanctions have always been one of the major tools in the foreign policy toolbox, both for the European Union and the US vis-a-vis the Lukashenko regime. But in order to address your question correctly, I think it's important to underline that there are different types of sanctions. These sanctions were adopted as a result of different reasons, and they pursue slightly various goals. So, for example, if we look at the EU sanctions, we can say that there are at least 4 different reasons why the European Union decided to adopt restrictive measures. One of them was response to the post-electoral crisis and the brutal suppression of protests, harsh repressions. The second reason was the forced downing of the Ryanair plane. The third was the migration crisis, which Lukashenko orchestrated on the EU borders. And the fourth major reason for adopting restrictive measures was Lukashenko's involvement in Russia's war against Ukraine. And if we look at the types of sanctions, they can be broadly categorized in 2 big groups: individual, personal sanctions, and economic or sectoral sanctions. And individual sanctions, as the name suggests, they target specific individuals who basically are involved in repressing the democratic process or help the Lukashenko regime in any other ways. And the major instruments of these sanctions is to put assets freeze on the individuals and also introduce visa bans. And this type of sanctions, they have an immediate effect in a way. But if we look at the economic sanctions, the goal of which is to target specific strategic sectors of the Belarusian economy, for instance, potash, fertilizers, or wood processing industry, or energy processing industry, or Belarusian military industrial complex. The effect of sanctions can be slightly delayed. One needs to have a longer breath, if I can use this expression, to see these sanctions work. And for the time being, what we can see kind of mixed sort of effect of these sanctions. And this is due to Russia's help. This is due to the fact that Belarusian economy has basically reoriented to Russia's market and managed to stay afloat thanks to Russia's generous support. Another point that I would like to briefly touch on is the response of Belarusian regime to sanctions. And Lukashenko has sent mixed signals regarding sanctions. On the one hand, he says that sanctions make him only stronger. Sanctions provide the opportunity for Belarus to find new markets, new investors. But on the other hand, he basically passed laws that criminalize calls for sanctions. Those who call for sanctions, they risk being put to prison for around 6 years. And also, basically, he uses sanctions as a way to build this negative image of the West as an evil power. I think he wouldn't do that if sanctions didn't really hurt him. Right. And also, I would like to add on the additional instruments with the Western community can use to put pressure on the Lukashenko regime. One of such instruments is, of course, diplomatic isolation. Lukashenko can be continued, isolated in the different international fora, different international arena, for example, within the United Nations. But and also a big package of instruments involves support to the various stakeholders in the Belarusian democratic movement, civil society, media, Belarusian democratic forces. All these stakeholders, they are agents of change, and with adequate support, they are the ones who will put pressure on the Lukashenko regime.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I am going to turn with one final question for Artyom because we're getting actually a phenomenal number of questions that are coming in for our audience. So I want to be able to turn to them. But Artyom, maybe building on what Victoria is talking about, kind of again, Western governments and their approach. Can you maybe, if we look at, on the one hand, Lukashenko, what do you think longevity, or what do you think the future is for he himself, his regime? But also, as has been mentioned, I'm sure people are very curious. The connections between Lukashenko and Putin. What are the connections between those two regimes? What do you think is the longevity for that?
Thank you. I think that this couple of questions actually should go, always together because the longevity of Lukashenko regime is the direct function of the longevity of his relationship with Vladimir Putin. I would argue that currently these two gentlemen live probably through one of the best phases of their decades of cooperation, because in the times of war, the services that the Lukashenko regime is ready and eagerly provides to Russia in this war are very much appreciated by Putin. And there is simply no signs of any past animosity or hostility or trade disputes in their relationship. I'm not sure that there is a lot of trust between these two, given how many times in the past there have been promises broken and the understanding of both of them that in the end, if it comes to making a choice, each of them would prefer their own self-interest over this friendship. At the same time, right now, at least since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I think that this duet, I would say, works relatively smoothly, at least for Lukashenko, for his purposes of maintaining the stability of Belarusian economy and stability of his regime. So his future and his political future in this regard, I think, also completely depends on his ability to maintain this equilibrium that we have. And of course, this is not a given, because historically speaking, this honeymoon phase of relationship is not a norm of their relationship. It is rather an exception. And the relations before the war, let's say before 2020 in Belarus, were much more tense. And because none of us knows how and when this war will end, and what would be the Russian foreign policy priorities and capacities after this hot phase of this war in Ukraine, it's very hard to right now predict in what kind of territory Lukashenko will find himself in after this war vis-a-vis Russia, because it matters whether Russia will become more assertive towards Belarus, would want to incorporate Belarus, for example, or to press for more integration because it, for example, failed to achieve its goals in Ukraine. Or to the contrary, Russia will be weakened or disinterested or, appreciating Lukashenko's services less, and therefore the amount and the flow of necessary economic subsidies will be shrinking. And these questions are critical for the regime that is approaching the transition period, not because Lukashenko wants it, but because he has entered his 8th decade of age. It's his 4th decade in power. And obviously, looking at the American politics, for example, definitely 70 years is not the limit. But we also have to be, sober enough that in the next likely 10 years, there will be a generational change in Belarusian and Russian politics to this matter. So in this perspective, for Lukashenko, it matters a lot in what shape he will find himself in terms of his relationship with Putin. And I think for him, I think that constitutionally speaking, and if we get to the issue of transition, constitutionally speaking, the system is ready. 3 years ago, he rewrote the constitution. Actually, it happened like 3 days after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. And he has created this parallel body for himself to which he will probably step aside when and if he actually greenlights the transition. This is a model that is similar to that of Kazakhstan, but there are two big reasons why I think he will be procrastinating and delaying this decision. First of all, Kazakhstan is actually an unsuccessful example for the previous president, for the first president of Kazakhstan. And Lukashenko, I think, learned this lesson that there is no amount of written constitutional guarantees that can secure your future or your status or your guarantees or your immunities if the successor simply doesn't want to do it. And yes, you can try to keep the power within your family, but even this does not guarantee you complete, safety, as we sometimes see in Central Asia, where, in Turkmenistan, for example, the son has not been 100% in line with the directives of his father. And this is the one reason, the absence of real guarantees. And secondly, I think that for Lukashenko to make this, important move and to find a successor, he needs to be secure about not just his domestic situation, which is possible given the level of repression, to just simply ensure that there is no domestic challenges to his power when he finally wants to experiment with transition, but also with the foreign context, with the regional context. And because the context around Belarus is so fundamentally unstable and will unlikely stabilize in the foreseeable future, it's very hard to predict that he will, make this most important decision of his life when he doesn't know what the region will look like in a year from now, what his relationship or Minsk's relationship with Russia will look like in 6 months from now. And therefore, I think that most likely, scenario in this environment is, and I'm of course fully speculating here, is him procrastinating to the moment where he can no longer actually control the power transition because he's either too old and sick, or he's dead, or some other unintended, unprovoked, unforeseeable variables enter the picture. And therefore, right now, I wouldn't put too much attention to what is written in Belarusian constitution or other legal, acts regarding the status of the former president or how Lukashenko actually constitutionally prepares it. Rather, we should look at the actions. Is there a successor that Lukashenko publicly endorses and pushes him or her up the ladder of bureaucracy? If there is some more or less predictable stabilization of both the domestic and foreign context around Belarus. If none of it is present, we can we have no reliable indicators of an imminent transition of power.
Thank you, Artem. And actually, it's one of the questions I was going to ask all of you later was some of the indicators you're going to be looking at, but I will hold my question because we have had so many fantastic questions coming in from our audience members. So I want to turn to those. I know we're running short on time, but take the next 10, 12 minutes and go through some questions. And maybe just for our panelists, so that we can get to as many of the audience members' questions as possible. Maybe try to keep the answers, to the 60, 90-second remark if possible, just to give us a succinct answer. Because again, we do have, again, audience, please feel free to continue sending your questions via the Q&A function at the base, but we'll start now. First question that came in, Tim Adelna with the Wilson Center. He's a Department of State fellow with us for the year. And we've somewhat gone through this, but maybe someone can kind of summarize, has the Belarusian opposition in exile been able to maintain political momentum, or has it lost influence over time? And have they been able to engage Belarusians inside the country, given the regime's crackdown on dissent? Are they seen as a credible alternative, or is there a disconnect between those abroad and those inside Belarus? So any of you, maybe just, I know we touched on this already a little bit, but anyone want to give kind of a summative statement?
Okay, I can comment on that, even though I don't think that my comments will differ a lot from what Artem has earlier mentioned already. But I do think that the Belarusian opposition in exile is, for organic and natural reasons, losing its access to the Belarusian population, and it does lose its access to the influence, political influence, which is, I'm stressing this out again, a natural cause, a natural effect of the Belarusian opposition being pushed to the exile and to other countries. At the same time, I do think that there were a couple of missed opportunities that could have been realized. And I'm not going to dive deeper into that, but it regards the declaration of the status of the Belarusian opposition and its the form and shape in which the opposition has been developing, mostly focusing on first institutionalizing itself and building new organizations, institutions that has been a point of criticism for a long time now, and focusing on rather coordinating and debating about the situation within the oppositional structures. It's natural as well on the one hand, because it's a procedural agreements that needs to be made in the absence of the pre-existing institutions that in practice have to be built from the beginning. But on the other hand, of course, the Belarusian population was expecting probably something more and some more influence on the situation within the country. And primarily it regards the protection of their rights, but also the Belarusian opposition that has been starting to work a lot in exile, with mostly engaging with lobbying on legalization issues for the Belarusians in exile and proposing some of the measures to protect the Belarusians who are, for example, deprived of deprived of their funding and etc. So lobbying and international connections of the Belarusian opposition will be crucial for the future of Belarusian. Belarus is a country that will be on the way to democratize. But at the same time, for now on, I would not expect even if the best scenario would be realized, I would still not expect the Belarusian inside the country willing to engage with the opposition which is outside, not because they're doing a lot of failure and very debatable steps, but also because it's dangerous in practice.
Thank you, Alessia. Next question we have from George Kroll. Belarusian analyst Natalia Radzina recently commented that many Belarusians, she claims up to 50%, simply avoided voting in the elections, exhibiting their attitude toward the election. What do panelists think of this assertion? She also said it showed democratic opposition abroad failed too because they did not encourage people to stay away. So basically comments again on the election. Anything you can assert?
Yeah, maybe I can chip in, and being mindful of the time, I will be rather brief. So I think to begin with, it's difficult to believe any concrete numbers. We don't know how many people voted in the elections, how many people abstained. So all these numbers are very much approximate. And the second aspect of that is that I would argue Belarusian democratic forces, yes, they have not very strong links with Belarusians inside Belarus, but they managed to leverage these elections and basically hold Belarus high on the agenda among the Western policymakers. For instance, I will give a few examples. They organized a march in Warsaw against these fraudulent elections, which was joined by many people. A big conference was organized that Belarusians deserve better. They lobbied the European Parliament to adopt a resolution, basically calling for free and fair elections in Belarus. And overall, if you look at the Polish stance, Poland is currently the president of the Council in the European Union. Poland is being very supportive of the Belarusian democratic movement. Radoslaw Sikorski, Polish Prime Minister, he called Svetlana Tikhanovskaya a president-elect on the 26th of January.
Thanks. Thank you, Victoria. Next question comes from Mitchell Pullman. He says, hello, I was an OSCE long-term elections observer in Belarus in 2015. At that time, the most independent political activists were people who were self-employed, mostly in the IT sector. Seems that now there's no possibility for people to be self-employed, and most of the IT sector is now in exile or in prison. Can somebody comment on this?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think that this is a somewhat, it is an exaggeration to say that the IT sector is been, wiped out. It has lost a significant percentage of its workforce, let's say, and mostly the senior staff, the best engineers, the CEOs of the companies have left. Some companies have shut down. Western capital have fled the country, but most of actually like IT specialists are still in the country. Many of them have reoriented towards Russian contractors and Russian demand because it has become toxic for many Western companies to order services from Belarus or from, Belarusian companies with Belarusian roots. And yes, the IT sector was one of the biggest losers of this, troubles that Belarus underwent in the last 5 years. But it has been growing for now, I would say half a year, if I'm not mistaken. So it found its bottom in a way and has been rebounding. And when it comes to self-employment, again, the same picture here. It has not been wiped out. The government does a lot to prevent people from being, self-sustainable, or government, raises taxes. There are a lot of new regulations adopted to complicate the life of private business. At the same time, there haven't been statistically a big drop in the number of people employed by the private sector because of this outflow of many specialists and IT and so on and so forth. So again, Belarusian private sector, I would say it's still a relatively vibrant, sector of the economy and of the society to this matter. And I would even go as far as to say that this is probably the biggest hope that we should have for the future democratization of Belarus is its resilient private sector of economy that still exists even under this constant regulatory harassment that they face within the country.
Yeah, Victoria, thank you, Artem. Victoria, did you want to add something quickly?
Maybe just very quickly, I would like to take this opportunity to highlight the important role of the IT sector during the 2020 protests. They were the drivers of protests. One of the IT representatives, Pavel Liber, he created a so-called platform for alternative counting of votes called Voice. And IT sector representatives, various representatives of the IT sector, they continue helping Belarusian democratic movement abroad. For instance, they helped to organize the elections to the so-called quasi-parliament, the coordination council, which took place in May last year, and they continue helping in various other means.
Thank you, Victoria. I know we are running. We're at 11, or we're at time right now. I want to take one more quick question, a quick answer maybe from the audience, or question from the audience, and then I've got a final question for our group. But building on the OSCE, talking about the OSCE election observer, this is a question from Jessica Nash. She says, you mentioned that Belarus did not have OSCE election observers in this election. As Belarus is a member state of the OSCE, what do you think OSCE could be doing differently or better to improve the political situation? So that is maybe in just beyond that, what again, kind of multilateral, bilateral, any of these, what could be doing differently, specifically OSCE, but maybe other organizations? And anyone feel free to kind of quickly weigh in on that.
With a shortage of time, would you allow me to be a little bit blunt?
Sure, yeah, of course.
I don't think OSCE can do anything regarding Belarus simply because these kinds of organizations don't have any leverage vis-a-vis countries that don't want to cooperate. As simple as this.
No, I think that's yes. No, thank you. Victoria,
Yes,
please.
that's very much true. I would just probably add that one of the mechanisms that I think OSCE can still utilize is the so-called Moscow mechanism, which is used for sort of rapid investigations of the human rights violations. And it was already activated by the OSCE in the aftermath of the 2020 protests. I think it's time to activate it again.
Excellent. Thank you both. And mindful of the time, one final question I want to ask maybe each of you to give your kind of final thoughts. And I apologize to the audience members that we can't get to all these questions. We will save them because they are excellent questions. But if I could ask each of you maybe just to sum up in a minute or so, we're in a lot of political transitions taking place across the world right now. If you were given the opportunity to talk to European or US policymakers, how would you explain maybe just in a sentence or two, why Belarus matters? Why do you think they should care? Why should they write it into their policy pronouncements or their bilateral discussions? What do you think would be salient points to make? We'll start with Alessia and then Victoria and then Artyom.
Thank you for this question. It feels like rather a question to the politicians or a democratic opposition of Belarus, but I would mainly advocate for Belarus as the important part of the region where we saw how the consequences of not paying enough attention to the country have paid during the recent events of the recent years, with the escalation, not being able to keep Belarus in the loop, not being able to support and influence the situation in the country towards democratization and liberalization has brought Belarus, including that, of course, Lukashenko's action himself, but also brought Belarus to this situation where it's very tight and close to Russia. So I would say it matters regionally as a matter of regional security. It does matter as an example of the country that has been able to topple the dictator after 30 years, and any kind of support would really mean that if Belarus succeeds, there would be a great example of how the autocracy can die.
Thank you. Victoria.
I would just add that Belarus is a land of highly educated people, and we have already touched on the role and importance of the IT sector. But in addition to IT specialists, we have highly educated doctors, physicists, mathematicians. Belarus has always excelled in STEM disciplines. Belarus is a European country. It has rich historical legacy. It belongs to Europe. And in fact, European Union has already fixed in its council conclusions, which is a guiding document which sort of regulates its policy to Belarus, that the doors of Europe are open to democratic Belarus. It would be great if US also under the new administration, Trump administration, understands the importance of Belarus for regional security, understands the potential of Belarus, and also helps to support the democratic.
Thank you, Victoria. Artem, final comments.
Yeah, as much as I would like to be brief, I need to make several points here. First of all, there is the regional security dimension that the colleagues have outlined, which I completely agree. And just to put one very simple example, if Belarus would not be in the Russian orbit to the way it was by February 2022, there wouldn't have been assault on Kiev from the north. There wouldn't have been all the massacres in Bucha and the places around Kiev, because these were the troops that entered Ukraine because Belarus was basically subdued as the state, as the regime by early 2022. And this is, I think, the ramification of this long existing, authoritarian regime that wasn't confronted, boldly enough, but also that wasn't, paid much attention to its evolution or rather degradation. And there are many other local sort of cases here, case studies like the migrant crisis that the regime facilitates on its western borders and basically bothering its western neighbors, like the interception and the forced landing of the Ryanair civilian aircraft 3.5 years ago. So this is a regional troublemaker, and so there is no question in the region, in Poland, Baltic countries, even in Germany, I would say, why caring about democratization of Belarus matters for everyone in this region. Secondly, there is probably a minor issue, but still important, is in a post-war Ukraine reconstruction effort. Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states are the very organically, economically connected lands and countries. They have the same, railway since the Russian Empire even. There were this very, long and potentially fruitful discussions of a lot of connectivity and mobility projects from Baltic Sea to Black Sea via Belarus, and it would be a perfect supply route to Ukraine for all the necessary goods and out of Ukraine of its exports to Baltic Sea if the Black Sea remains blocked by Russia, for example. But Belarus is right now unavailable as the part of this, potential route, which would be very important for supplying and supporting Ukraine. And thirdly, as Lesia has also, hinted, it matters as an example for other pro-democratic movements in the world, whether the West, Europe, allows the 2020 crackdown in Belarus to become the analog of Belarusian Tiananmen, square kind of development, where it only solidifies the regime for decades, or it becomes something like a first stage of Polish solidarity uprising in early 1980s, where it was, succeeded by a second wave in the late 1980s that successfully toppled the communist dictatorship of Poland through the round table, but still it was a successive victory of pro-democratic movement. So it matters what kind of signal it sends to the world, whether the West is actually able to care about democracy in its backyard.
Thank you, Artem. And I'm just blown away by the discussion, and again, underscoring the fact that Belarus tends to be overlooked, unfortunately, in so many discussions, and this just underscores how important it is to be discussing it. So I want to thank very much our three guests we've had today, Alessia Rudnik, Artyom Shredman, and Dr. Victoria Liopowicz. I want to thank our audience members very much for joining us. Excellent questions that came in, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. Again, thank you for this very timely, very important discussion, which we hope to, as I mentioned at the outset, we at the Kennan Institute are attempting to bring more attention to Belarus. So this was the beginning of that. And so please encourage you to visit our website and join us for additional discussions or read some of the articles we're going to have coming out. So thank you again very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.